what they have not done. The budget says, we will invest in capex, and that will have a multiplier factor. Now, if assuming 10 lakh crore gets invested, the implication on this country is 50 lakh crore. This, to my mind, is a significant game changer, which this government has done, perhaps for the first time ever. It had spent about 7.5 lakh crore in the earlier budget, but this is a sea change. One, that's the hardware. What's the software? In order to enhance the hidden wealth in every country, it has been held time and again that the country needs to have employable education. If a country's people have employable education, things automatically falls into place. If you look at the budget, and when I was looking at the budget in detail, of course, we all know that in education, the government has, instead of 1 lakh crore last year, this year they are spending 1,12,000 crore, which is fantastic. 1,13,000 crore, which is fantastic. However, if you look deeper into it, you will find that there are items which has been mentioned there, which was budgeted at zero earlier. And this item, which is building the soft skill of our countrymen, is presented at 9,000 crore. And two items out of this so-called 9,000 crore, 1/3 of that is going to enhance the skill of the people, skill development. It was always there, but a focused approach, to my mind, makes a lot of difference. Number two, this government is going to, out of this 9,000 crore, 4,000 crore goes to enhance the educational capabilities of 14,500 schools. So they have picked 14,500 schools, pumping in 4,000 crore and upgrading the school. And I have not seen even one comment somewhere talking about it. The government has also, in this so-called 9,000 crore, allocated 550 crores to upgrade the skill of the handicrafts and the people who are doing the basic handicrafts of the country. 550 crores. You will say, why 550 crores? Why not 5,000 crore? It is not easy to build in skills. So therefore, in my view, the soft skill focus, which was not there earlier, will enhance our employability and our ability to earn more money, which is a soft, and of course hard factor, which is the capex, which to my mind will have at least a 5x.
So both the infrastructure and the set of skills and education push for the population. Mr. Basu, if I can come to you, sir. Your opening thoughts, key takeaways that you found from the budget, from your perspective.
Thank you, Shubhendu, and pleasure being here in this Doordarshan panel. I think the first thing about 2-3 things strike me when we look at the budget. I think budget is a statement of income, expenditure, how the government will. And I think this government, over the last few years, one thing they have made clear is that each budget is a continuum, part of a continuum. The policies which the government espouses are reasonably well known by now, focus on infrastructure, capital expenditure. But this budget is significant because it is perhaps the first one when we are hopefully almost clearly away from COVID-19, which had impacted the way we had gone about. And so therefore, but this is also, it has to be viewed in the backdrop of certain global developments. There is growth has become a challenge across the developed world. Inflation, we have not seen this kind of global inflation for the last 50 years, I think, since the 1970s. It's a huge challenge for countries. You go to the UK and you hear inflation of 8%, 10% and things like that, which was unheard of. Whereas this was reasonably common in India till recently. So what the government, I think, sets out to do in this budget is, there is a long-term vision. This is part of a continuum in that long-term vision, which has been given this name of Amritkaal because we are going to be 100 years old in 25 years' time. But along with that, what it seeks to do is to balance the growth objectives of the economy with fiscal prudence. So we are already, as you know, there is a mandated 4.5% fiscal deficit, which is mandated by an act, and for various reasons, COVID-19, etc., we have exceeded that. They have pegged it down to 6.4, and they have given a direction that hopefully will be reaching 4.5. Similarly, on growth, Mr. Banerjee mentioned about capex. there is a huge spending by the government, hoping that this will lead into crowding in private investment. So far, that has not happened to the desired extent. You know, at one point in time, banks were being blamed because they were not ready to lend. That is also now a thing of the past. We'll have to now see to what extent private investment or companies willing to spend comes in. That's one. I think the other thing to me which is very important, and the budget seeks to address that by looking at the MSME sector, is that in India, unfortunately, we are now focusing a lot on manufacturing. You know, it has been a services-led growth. We have more people in agriculture than we should, and those who have come out of it have come to services. Manufacturing, ideally, we would have been very happy if it had constitute 25% of the economy, but it is at 16%. And schemes like PLI, which has been supported in this budget, the infrastructure spending by the government, that seeks to redress that. However, what we so far see is that, one, the capex expenditure by the private sector is not going up to the extent that we would be happy about. And second, it is modern methods of production, etc., make it less, you need less people. And so employment opportunities there are constrained. Construction, which has been focused upon, railways, roads, should help in that. So that is something which I feel is a very major positive in this budget. Out of the infrastructure spending increase of 35%, I think 7.5 lakh crores to 10 lakh odd crores. Railways has got about 2 lakh 50, and roads also there is a very significant increase. So that should lead to employment. But other than that, I think it is the hope that ancillary industries which will emanate will lead to MSMEs, which have always been the employment generator.
Right.
So roughly upfront, these would be my feeling. They have sought to address all the issues that are currently very important for the country, and it is in execution that we will see.
Right, and we will
results.
talk about each of these themes. Dr. Soumya Ghosh, sir, I think it's quite profound that we reiterate that the economic recovery from the pandemic is complete, is what the economic survey said. That makes the opportunity of this budget particularly significant. Sir, your key takeaways from the union budget.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel discussion. I'll start the budget with 3 dimensions, which basically is important. I think as have been emphasized by the earlier speakers in terms of the fiscal prudence, India was the only country that had witnessed a surge in the tax to GDP ratio during the pandemic. I think from 10%, this number had gone up to 11.4% last year. This year, it is 11.1%. So that's a creditable achievement for any country where the world was devastated with COVID. Taking this step forward, if you look into the budget this year, basically there are 3 things. The first is the capital expenditure, is everybody showing about. The total capital expenditure for that matter is actually 18.5 trillion. If you take into account 10 trillion for the government, the creation of capital assets, and the internal and external budgets of the public resources, the enterprises. So it's 18, which is 6.2% of GDP, and this capital expenditure is the highest in the last 18 years as a percentage of GDP. Second point is that in terms of, as you know, the fiscal deficit can be either productive or non-productive depending on whether you spend on capital expenditure or on revenue deficit. Revenue deficit as a percentage of capital expenditure is at 48.7% or less than 50%, which at some time was as high as 80% couple of years back during the pandemic, and this is the highest in 17 years. And finally, subsidy as a percentage of GDP, which had jumped to 3.7% with the pandemic, is now at 1.3% of GDP, which is again the lowest in 17 years. So we have a budget that walks the talk on fiscal prudence, have set numbers which are at multi-year highs or lows depending on their priorities. And I think that's the first thing regarding
Mr. Mishra's
Yes.
numbers. The kind of intentions that we are seeing here in state level capex is something to again feel very happy about. See, one of the things that has not picked up in India so far is private corporate capex. 10 years back, private corporate capex stalled in India, and until now, the portion of the largest share of our capex in the country. So capex is done by households, corporates, and government. Government numbers are rising, and but until private corporate capex picks up, we are not going to see the needle move in the way we want to. So there, two parts are very, 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 very heartening. One is how states have picked up now, and secondly, we are off the twin balance sheet crisis. The kind of NPAs that we had from the bank perspective and the kind of leverage we have in the corporate sector, we've had in the corporate sector, are no longer sort of there. In this point, we have many things that are going on for this economy, which will touch 5 trillion by around 2026. And does the budget put us in the right direction to reach that 5 trillion mark? I believe so.
Right. If we talk about capex a little more, given that it is right at the heart of the manner in which the union budget envisions the road ahead for the year and also for the Amritkaal period, Dr. Soumyakanti Ghosh, if I can come to you. This is 3 years in a row that we've seen a record high capex investment plan. What has been the experience so far, the cascading impact that it has on the development of the infrastructure, job creation, because we're also talking about a very difficult period of the pandemic that we've come out from. What has been the experience so that we get an idea about what to expect from this record high capex investment plan?
Yeah, just to give you a perspective, I think out of 10 trillion, railways, roadways, and defense corner 67% overall 10 trillion. So there is a significant emphasis on building India. I think that we remembered that quadrilateral. So I think that is now being developed so that the logistic cost and other costs come down significantly. Because India is a country where more than 10% of the cost is logistics, and government has already set up the logistic policy. So that is point number one. Regarding the second point, which the budget is emphasizing in terms of crowding in, I think if I just take 1 second, in macroeconomic parlance, there are two concepts. Either you crowd in or you crowd out. But in where demand is basically, if the demand is not significant, then in that case, crowding out becomes more important. Empirical studies in the Indian context shows that public investment actually crowds in resources if the government works on a path of fiscal prudence. So hopefully that will happen. Now, if you are asking me the question whether private investment has started to happen, I think there are signs of private investment happening. I think last year, for the 9 months, if I look into the numbers which is there in public domain, as per independent estimate, the announcements of public total investment was around 21 trillion. Now, out of this 21 trillion, the experience shows 35 to 40% is actually translated on the ground. So even if we take 40% of 21 trillion across several sectors, I think that is going to be a decent number in terms of pickup. And it's the breakup between government and private, where private investment is actually picking up. And finally, if you look into this breakup of where the investment is happening, the good thing is that corporate balance sheets are now very healthy and strongly and deleveraged. There are new sectors like healthcare, which is a new sunrise sectors. There are other sectors like roads, then highways, then pharmaceuticals, steel, cement, and across all sectors, you will actually see an evidence that there are more rating upgrades which are happening rather than rating downgrades. So that means that this is picking up pace. Possibly how far it extent goes in terms of the encompassing, that will time will tell, because the only problem in this world is, the only certainty in this today world is the uncertainty. You know what happened yesterday in terms of the global economic, geopolitical conflict. A new era of geopolitical conflict could be now opening up on the anniversary of this one. So I think that these are actually things which has to be taken into consideration. But my sense is that India will continue to move in the path where it has ushered in the next couple of years.
Right. Mr. Banerjee, the emphasis that you laid on capital expenditure, the manner in which industry receives such news about significantly high capex. We're talking about last mile connectivity, we're talking about critical infrastructure, multimodal infrastructure. All of it would contribute to the economy coming together in a very strong manner. So if you could give us a perspective from the industry point of view, how do they see the infrastructure becoming state of the art with this sort of a focus?
Industry always looks for an ecosystem to invest. And a government can help to create an ecosystem. In fact, government is the prime reason for an ecosystem. Infrastructures are not created by private sector. Roads are not built by private sector. Airports, railway lines are not built by private sector, barring a few exceptions here and there in the world. So the fact that such huge, humongous amount of money will now be spent by the government towards infrastructure will necessarily mean that the private sector would now come forward to invest. Now, take an example of an industrial corridor. When an industrial corridor is made, now corridor means there is a road, there is railway lines, there are ecosystem government has made. Now, obviously, now industries can be set up based on the advantage that area could have. An economic corridor could be food related, could be agriculture related, could be health related, for whatever reason. But important issue which now private sector would be looking at, the conversion of the intent of 10 lakh crore to be spent, will it actually get spent? It's not easy to spend this amount of money. We all know that, let us say we want to repair our own home and we want to repair it in 7 days and it takes months together and the home doesn't get repaired. CapEx is a typical case of that. So somehow, if the government can even invest 80-90% of the so-called announcements, I think we, the industry, are definitely looking forward to jumping into the bandwagon and taking advantage of the so-called announced Amritkaal.
Right. Mr. Arijit Basu, if I can come to you, sir. Ahead of the union budget, one positive information shared by the economic survey was about the health of our financial institutions, of our banks, with the minister also talking about the manner in which the NPA has been controlled now. How does that augur well for the growth story that we are looking ahead, talking about India as a bright spot in global economy?
Yes, that is very important. But just to give some context
Yes.
As to what exactly happened and why we should feel happy about what has happened in the banking system. So it was not, and when I was in the bank, I was asked this question very often, that because of the NPA crisis, the banks are unwilling to lend. So while to some extent it was true, it was also true that there was no demand. I do not recall very few instances where there was an approach that was being made to a bank like State Bank of India for some project, and we said that, because we have an NPA crisis, we are not going to lend. So it was not necessarily that it was the bank's unwillingness to lend. It is true that we have, based on the experience over the last 10 years, banks have tightened their credit underwriting systems. When you are taking a very high risk when you are doing project finance, infrastructure finance. And definitely when your credit costs come down, essentially credit cost is saying that your fresh accretion to NPAs is very, very minimal. And you are able to generate profits of, I think, all the public sector banks together in this financial year may generate close to 1 lakh crore of profits, paying the government dividend of 48,000 crores. That is very good news for the country. But at the end of the day, it all depends, banking system's health depends on the economic health and economic vibrancy of the country. And all the portents for that are very positive. Budget is an example of trying to take advantage of that and going forward. But as I said, the dark spots would be what happens internationally. It's very, very difficult in today's world. We know how globalized we are. We are linked to global supply chains. We saw, how the automobile sector was so deeply impacted.
Right.
Not because of COVID, but because of the fact that they were not able to get the chips. So if those kind of things get repeated, Shomokanti mentioned about Mr. Biden's visit yesterday and saying that they are more directly now into the war. How this will change, we don't know. But to some extent, I think, India's domestic economy itself will be a driver. and to that extent, I think we are protected. Banks, both in the private sector and in the public sector, are well positioned to lend. And as I said, that the lending, the appetite for lending will not only come from the large borrowers, but will also come from the smaller MSMEs. And I think one of the very good aspects of this budget has been providing the additional 9,000 crores which the Minister of State had mentioned, which will enable them to give another 2 lakh crores. It's very important that the mid-corporate and the MSME sector remains above the water, so to say, if we are to succeed in our overall plans.
Right. Dr. Shaumikanti Ghosh, on the MSME aspect, I want to come to you. Often seen as a driver of the economy, also adversely impacted during the pandemic. And now we're talking about the economic impact of the pandemic getting over. What kind of impetus is the budget giving to the MSE? I mean, with Spirit Link, additional 9,000 crore is also being prescribed, sir. Your view on how this sector is set to take off?
Yeah. Before I answer the MSME
Yes.
sector, just very quickly 2 points
Sure.
addition which our other panelist has said. Mr. Banerjee was saying in terms of the the system has been able to spend the capital expenditure. Last year the target was 7.5 trillion. The government in the revised budget has said they are spending 7.2 trillion. And this year, so I hope that this year also this number is closer to 10 trillion. And secondly, to Mr. Basu's argument, I think that's this demand. One important point I want to know about this, crowding in. Whenever the credit cycle starts, it's always the public sector banks which crowd in the private sector banks. It has been the story in the past also, and there is an story in the economic survey which says that at the height of India's growth story in 2004 to 8, it was the public sector banks which has actually contributed to the infrastructure push. Having said that, I think regarding the MSME sector, there has been a lot of was written in the MSME sector in the pandemic that the informal sector was devastated. I think, yes, there was an impact on the informal sector. You all know that what the second wave COVID did. But it is also a remarkable thing to say that the MSME sector credit growth today is actually at more than 20%. And the overall MSME share in the credit growth to industry is 10%. One of these reasons is the ECLGS scheme, which has been a significant successful. I think this was one of the suggestions the bank, the SBI had, our bank had made during the crisis. And the other thing is that the credit guarantee scheme is also being reformed, as you said, 9,000 crore. And finally, and data initiative, this is one I want to mention, is that the government has recently launched an Uddam portal. Now, what it is doing in the Uddam portal is the total number of MSME units in India which pay taxes around 1.14 million. In India, there is no study on the number of MSME units. The last time a study was done in 2016, which said the total number of units around 6.3 crores, of which 99% is micro units. So even if out of these 14 million which are registered, and these are exactly the number of GST and taxpayers, the government has actually said that we will now have a system whereby even if you don't have the PAN card, this micro units, you will be allowed to register on this Uddam portal from the back end. So imagine that if these units are allowed to register on the back end, brought back into this formal credit delivery mechanism, the amount of credit which could unleash in the system. And there has been several data initiatives the government has done. 28.5 crores are able to register on the Uddam, on the eShram portal, unorganized worked out in a span of 5 months. So the data which shows, and this is also from our, if we look into our the bank's data, is that there is evidence of SME units are getting bigger. As you know, SME definition is now based on turnover. So there is an evidence that some SME units have now become bigger, and they are actually getting into the corporate credit group, which we call in our bank. So if this is the case, that means they are getting integrated into the value chain because of the PLI scheme. These are all initial way of looking into the structural transformation. But any structural transformation in Indian economy is trying to do will take time. But I'm very happy that the MSME sector has been witness to some remarkable changes, and the changes also in the government of this Vishwakarma scheme, whereby you bring the Indian artisans together and integrate to the value chain. I think this will all
specialized focus on the skill sets of the local population.
And it's always a good idea to do all these things so that it actually is a cornerstone of India's growth story, like other countries, China.
Certainly, sir. And on that idea of skill set of the population, Dr. Patnaik, beyond hard infrastructure. There is also significant focus on the potential of the people, of the youth of the population. We see a greater focus on 21st century Industry 4.0, call what you may, skills. We're talking about AI, robotics, development in 5G, and specialized skill sets. How transformative could that be as we're preparing the youth with those skill sets for the years ahead?
So we have a median age of 28 years. That makes it one of the world's youngest countries. We've seen China, which until this year was the world's most populous country, see its population actually drop by 850,000 this year.
So that transformation is also happening in demography and population size.
Yes, indeed. And for India, the total fertility rate of the replacement value is about 2.1. We are around that number, but we will have this so-called demographic dividend for the next 2 decades or so. That's sort of the sweet period that we have. The question that one generally focuses there is, do we grow rich before we get old, or do we get old before we grow rich? From this perspective, getting the younger portion of the population access to technology, making them understand technology in a manner that is not something available from their schooling, requires skilling at an exponential level, population scale, as we kind of hear these days. And from this perspective, I think a lot of I would not say just the budget, there are a lot of initiatives that have been taken over the last few years translate into this permeation of technology into our lives. Aadhaar is only one, but Aadhaar's corollaries, as we call them, have been many. The number of investors into markets has exploded in the last 3-4 years. The number of users of smartphones, the access to banking, the access to credit, the access to digitized platforms, the kind of statements or steps taken by the government in this manner have been nothing short of revolutionary. UPI today, we all have spoken about it, is being discussed about to be used in several other countries. So Indians today can transact with each other in a manner not really heard of in most other countries of the world, and this is just the beginning. We have India Stack. There will be a similar stack for agriculture or for MSMEs also that has been discussed in the budget. So from what we see, this kind of soft infrastructure is something the budget is eagerly pushing. This is a trend that will differentiate our growth path over the next few years as we first cross Germany in the next 3 to 4 years, when we cross their GDP of $4 trillion US, and we cross Japan by the end of the decade. We cross their GDP of about $5 trillion US. So if India will become the world's 3rd largest economy by the end of the decade, these improvements in soft infrastructure, especially skilling, we must remember that our years of schooling at about 8 years is not something to be very happy about, and it takes years. It takes many years to increase that figure by even 1 year, and it's important that there are steps taken in skilling, and this is something that the budget has put focus to.
Right, Mr. Banerjee, that point about how we may have a population which is educated with degrees, but do they have the right skills to participate in the country's economic growth and development, and those particular skill sets, which sort of sound very futuristic but are need of the hour. What is the industry perspective on having that sort of skilled workforce getting ready?
You'll be surprised to hear from me that, to my mind, there is no shortage of jobs. Youngster feels that, oh, there are no jobs. There are jobs if you are capable. Just passing a BCom or a BA is no longer relevant. Pen pushers are no longer required. World has moved on. Country like India has moved on faster. We need hard skills. Of course, we need soft skills. But soft skills, how to behave, how to motivate, how to work hard, and all that is soft skills. The hard skill is we need to run a machine. We need to run a lathe machine. And top of that, currently, there are new technologies like artificial intelligence, big data. All that is coming in. Not only that, new vista of opportunities. For instance, this green technology, the EV cars, the EVs of the world, the electric vehicles. Who will manufacture them? Who will produce them? Our youth. our people. But if you are thinking from a distance that, oh wow, if I would have had an EV car, but why not make one? So with this global technology, India adapting the India stack, as we just discussed, and the ecosystem which is getting created by hundreds and thousands of crores being spent on capex, now it's for the future of the Indian generation to pick it up. We just need to learn the skills and the tricks of the trade, and there you have it. So, as I mentioned earlier, there is hardware and the software. Indian government is focusing on software. They are trying to skill you and me, but it is for us now to pick it up. Let's go down and learn the tricks, and believe in me, there is no lack of jobs, and we from the industry, we welcome each one of you. If you have the skill, we are there to take you.
Right. Mr. Basu, I want to come to the aspect of this budget trying to put more money in the hands of people through its taxation reforms, the kind of promotion it also does for the new tax regime. Some concerns for those of us who are still sort of oscillating between the old and the new tax regime. Is our saving culture, saving habit going to be impacted in a certain way? What is your thought on that, sir? Because the individual taxation and the culture of saving would be crucial going ahead.
Right, absolutely. I think on direct taxes, so there are two reforms which, since liberalization of the 1990s, which has been espoused and discussed in, one is in indirect tax, and we've got the GST in its, and it's more or less after 5 years, it's taken some shape. And the other is the direct tax code reform. And the thought process over there has been that what the government this time articulated a little more eloquently, saying that it should be the individual's decision to choose a particular investment or otherwise. And that in the old tax regime, that was not the philosophy behind the old tax regime, where it was felt that the government or the state should direct people regarding their social security and welfare, because financial literacy is not very high. The government has not given a timeline, but very clearly at some point in time, they will move away completely from the old tax regime. If you look at this year, I think they are even going to set up some kind of a portal where you can calculate, and people will just go by the calculation. Because I think I heard the finance minister somewhere in one of the interactions that she had. So when we talk of the old tax regime allowing you, no, one is simplify. Yeah. The other one is that you have various benefits. And sometimes as analysts, we just add them up. So 1,50,000 under 80C, 50,000 more under NPS, house rent, this and that. But every individual may not have the capacity to actually make those investments. And if you don't make those investments, or you don't have the capacity, and I remember at one point in time, I did not have the capacity to fully utilize the benefits that
we all go through that phase, but
we all have gone through that phase. So in which case the new regime may be more beneficial. Two other points that I wanted to make was, it's tried to touch both the bottom and the top, and it's very important for savings. Bottom, because you have raised the savings limit to 7 lakh crores, and you have given various other benefits. Top also, ultra HNIs, very small number, but I think if this additional, I think they were being charged at, it's brought down to 25%, the surcharge. It was much higher. So there could be a certain pool which may now get into, these are the kind of people who may invest in the digital ecosystem, startups, etc. So I think directionally, this budget has very clearly said that directionally, as I said, this budget is a continuum. It is going to move towards the new tax regime, but no timeline has been given. Just two other points not related to this as part of the discussion I just wanted to touch upon in a second. One is on infrastructure. Mr. Banerjee spoke very well. I think this budget is also focused on last mile connectivity, right? You know, there are, within the roadway sector, they are saying that we will, this is very important, we know as a banker as well, because unless and until you have a railway connection between the coal mine and the, you know, where the manufacture takes place, or a road, So that I think has been laid emphasis. The other one related to banks again is on the how do banks, you had asked me the question as to why do banks feel more confident.
Right.
I think this credit registry, which National Financial Registry that they are talking about, will make data accessible to everyone. And you can now use the Aadhaar-enabled ecosystem, you know, what we call the India stack, to be able to do it. We already have account aggregators from RBI. So I just wanted to highlight those two, although not related to the present
Sure.
question.
Mr. Banerjee wanted to add a point to that, then I'll come to
Quick
Mr.
point
Ghosh.
on taxation. One, fantastic for HNIs, high income group. The surtax has been reduced from 35% to 27.5%. Last 2 decades, at least we have not heard taxation coming down. It's fantastic. But there is one suggestion which I would like to make to the government is that while in the new tax regime, up to 7 lakh rupees, you are not getting taxed. But if I earn 7.5 lakhs, then I'm taxed from the minimum. The savings schemes have been withdrawn. Now, if I'm a youngster and I'm earning 7.5 lakhs and I pay my tax and spend everything, then there is no saving. In a country like ours, we need to somehow build in a forced savings. So, defocusing away from savings and focusing on lowering of tax rate, to my mind, is not the way nations can be built. We need to have a savings scheme so that the youngsters knows 1 lakh rupees or 1,50,000, 2 lakh rupees, I need to necessarily save. And that's always good for
The culture of saving has to be articulated and taken forward. Dr. Ghosh, another area where the budget lays particular focus is the manner in which cooperatives can be an engine of growth for the nation. If you could enlighten us, sir, how will that sort of take shape? So far, in the previous session also, we've seen that Gujarat, Maharashtra is where we've seen the success story of cooperatives. How do you take it forward from here?
No, I think that's also a very great area of reforms. I think in terms of the cooperative society, agricultural cooperative societies, I think the number, if I recollect in RBI document, is around 60,000. So that's not a small number. And these societies are actually could become the vehicle, and once these reforms are done, could actually become the vehicle for financial inclusion. And that is very important for the rural economy. I'll give you some data that why I think that this cooperative sector needs to be done. We have some excellent models in front of that, the Amul models and other models. But let me give you an idea that why we need to encourage the cooperative sector. You know, in the there is an regional rural banks are there. There was a reform which the government has done in terms of the regional rural banks, because of which what is now happening is that last in 2022 March ending, out of rupees 100, 66 rupees actually came from the women depositors. So this was the first time in the history that women are actually taking the lead, maybe at the bottom of the pyramid in rural areas and other areas also, in terms of deposit mobilization and financial empowerment. So I think once this cooperative reforms is done, this is going to enable more money coming in and more power and empowerment at the bottom of the pyramid, which has been a continuous endeavor on the part of this government.
Sir. And may I add the manner in which the budget also seeks to transform how self-help groups, women self-help groups, can play a key role ahead. But in that, many of us are curious about what could be that transformation. They're already doing an important work, but to become more active and empowered agents of economic growth, what is it that we can expect them to do?
Exactly the correct thing you have said. There was a reform which the government had done in the self-help groups, and after they did this reform in the self-help groups in the rural areas for the regional rural banks, you could see that there was a lot of deposits which have been flowing into the system from the area. So I think in terms of and there are examples of the self-help groups, because this is the best way to minimize the default and to help everybody get their share of share in the society in terms of the empowerment. The data which recently came through, I think, is in social domain, that there is now loans which are of the amount of 160 rupees, which are being lent to people at the bottom of the pyramid. So you can understand what could be the power of this cooperative movement, this data empowerment, which could do to the people in terms of giving them loans based on their credit history. Because it is always better to build up a credit history, and I think this could be just ideal launching pad for that.
Right. Dr. Patnaik, talking about ensuring that the economic benefits that the nation is making permeates to the bottom of the society as well. Inclusive budget is an important vision that the union budget lays. Also, I want to highlight the idea of how aspirational districts now is moving towards aspirational blocks. So there is more focus on even a smaller cross-section of our sort of administrative societies being in focus. How transformative could that be going forward?
So Niti Aayog especially started this competition across states, and
yes.
Told us how states are faring against each other. I mentioned earlier in the program how the kind of investment commitments that you are seeing in UP recently have given us some hope for private corporate capex revival. We have seen similar, one would call it welcome competitive federalism across states sort of coming up, and this has to be added to some of the aspects that the government is sort of looking at now. You'll be surprised to know that the data across block levels in digitized forms are available today on government platforms, where you can look at blocks, you can look at villages, and you can use that for planning, in a private corporate capex sort of atmosphere. This kind of technology enablement, and it kind of adds to the theme that we were looking at earlier, providing payment platforms, providing digital stack platforms, using information that is available with the population to be used by the population is something that will be transformative in the coming years. And these are areas where India excels, really. There are no other examples of this anywhere across in the world, and we are doing it at a population scale. So I think from that perspective, this will be certainly transformative.
Right. Mr. Basu, the idea of national financial information registry, data is seen as gold, and here we are talking about investments, empowerment at the rock bottom of the society. How important is this concept of the registry? What will it seek to do, sir?
No, this is very important. Actually, one of the lessons that we learned when the stressed asset problem overtook the banks was that banks had taken decisions based on incomplete or inadequate information, because it was not available, and it's not particularly easy to do that. So Reserve Bank has taken a lot of steps in that direction. You now have something called a CRIL-C, where you have to report all advances. The agencies like CIBIL are very active. There is a loan registry. The Reserve Bank has also taken an initiative to itself set up a credit registry. But it is primarily linked to, limited to banks and NBFCs. What this National Financial Registry now seeks to do is that the entire lending and borrowing ecosystem, as you are aware, has sort of gone around the economy. So you have these fintechs, the digital world, and one of the major announcements which were done a few years back was on the account aggregator scheme of the RBI. There are account aggregators already in place, and this financial registry will be one very, very important step towards that. It has two dimensions. One is the ability to view data. The second is it can be made more useful, more efficient by use of the latest technology. AI, ML, etc. can be used, and those who can then draw upon the data, it would be very, very important.
So it's important for both transparency
as well as the potential to lend. So I'll just give one example of who are the people who can benefit. So smaller MSMEs, they don't have a credit history. Many of them are still today not required to pay GST. GST is one way in which you can know something. So how do you then take a call as to someone's credit worthiness? And that can significantly change if everything can be captured. Whatever transactions that he does, can be captured in the National Financial Registry, and that is increasingly used by banks and NBFCs to further take lending to write down. Our credit coverage continues to remain a challenge.
All right. On that note, let me also turn to my audience. If you have questions that you would like to put to our panelists, be ready with those questions. Let me just put one important aspect to Mr. Patnaik, sir. When you're not representing the interests of the industry to the media, you're also writing books and writing books about the frauds, the challenges that it poses to the economy. As we stand today, sir, talking about India's growth journey from a developing country to a developed country, how strong has our regulatory system become to avoid the mistakes of the past?
Two significant changes. One is the Companies Act of 2013, that itself has, for the first time, defined what's a fraud. And people were not knowing what the fraud is. And number two, significant change, I think, is the introduction of Insolvency Banking Code. Why IBC has changed the way people do business, that the IBC says that if an entrepreneur takes money from the bank or you borrow money, and if you don't repay within 90 days, which is your NPA period, the ecosystem will give you another 330 days. And if you don't still settle the banking dues, the company can be auctioned off. Now, no entrepreneur wants to lose their baby. So the Companies Act and IBC definitely have changed the ecosystem. And to my mind, the GST regime has now tried to make everything official. Whether it's goods or services, it's all written, because if you don't pay GST, you need to pay GST everywhere, and that is therefore accounting for everything you do. However, to answer your main question, that is the world of corporate frauds changing? It is a view at the top. If the captain decides to cut corners, things can go wrong. And therefore, I feel, because the ecosystem and also the way the country has been moving, we as entrepreneurs have now become more responsible. Some irresponsible behaviors here and there will always happen. That's how world is. But I feel that the ecosystem and the industry per se is becoming more responsible, and hopefully we can now work together to make a great India sooner than later.
Right. So let me turn to the audience. If you have questions, sir, if you could introduce yourself first and the question.
Tax buoyancy, what we are looking at, almost average 1,50,000 per crore per annum. We have seen very positive capex in the last year. This year, 10 lakh crore. So, do you expect this 10 lakh crore to even mount further? Because we are talking about Amritkaal and capex is the vital. So, what's your view on that?
I said that last year the government had said what it is going to do. They have already achieved that. This year the total number is 10 trillion, and if you take total, it is 18.5 trillion. So my sense is that capital expenditure has been happening in sectors, and if you look into the history of the last 10 years from the data, the government has been doing public investment to crowd in private investment, and hopefully I think this process will continue, because to get a better infrastructure has a lot of secondary activities in terms of lower logistic costs. And also, I think you know in India that there is a distinction between the rail sector and the road sector. So if the road sector, the logistics develops, then you can also have some cargo movement through the road sector at a space, because there is always this distinction between how much cargo has to be carried through rail or road. So I think that is also another important initiative which the government is trying to do. So I think it's a step in the right direction, and if there is fiscal space available this year also, I mean, maybe the government could actually scale it up even further at later point of time. But once the private infrastructure starts to come in, it actually could remain at that level for an extended period.
Right. Any other question? Anyone else who would like to put a question to the panelists? So can we pass a mic to you, sir? If you can pass a mic to the gentleman here, please. So if you could please introduce yourself and your question.
Good afternoon all. Myself Santosh Gupta, professor from Vidyalangar College. My question is to Sir Patnaik sir. As Sir said, private corporate caps need to be picked up because as we want to go further and touching the short-term goal of $5 trillion by 2026. So what can be done, sir, for that? What need to, because that's something I also feel we are lacking to pick up the private corporate capex. Although the government has increased a good 33% from last budget for the capex, but still I also feel private corporate caps are still lacking. So what you can suggest or say something on that?
See, there are, for private corporate capex to pick up, first is your balance sheet allowing you to do it? Second is their demand. So the balance sheets today, as we had discussed in the panel earlier, the twin balance sheet crisis is probably behind us. Balance sheets are in their best shape in the last decade or so, corporate balance sheets. So they are in a position to take higher leverage. We had one of my panel colleagues comment that credit is available from banks for people. And that brings us to the next question, which is of demand. So if there is demand and the balance sheet allows it, there is no reason why private corporate capex should not really pick up. With India being the world's fastest growing economy for this year and likely to see a sort of real GDP growth number of around 6.5% over the next several years, we believe that this kind of demand in India, inherent demand, will definitely be there. I mentioned earlier that we have the world's youngest population, and I should also add that from a per capita income perspective, we have just crossed a phase, north of $2,000, where incremental consumption will now be discretionary. It will no longer be non-discretionary, and these are areas which will lead to private corporate capex. I just wanted to add to another thing that has happened from the government's perspective. See, in the last 3 years, for every single year, the budgeted number of kilometers for national highways has been crossed. So 10,000 kilometers budgeted, 13,000 kilometers done. We have one of the world's most powerful electric locomotives now being manufactured in Bihar at Madhepura. It's WAG-12. These were initially started at 2 locomotives, 3 locomotives. We are going 800 of them. Vande Bharat, everybody knows about them. Initially there were 2 trains, 4. The plan is to make 400 of them. So the kind of capex that's going to come up with these 10 trillion rupees of capex on an annual basis, and these numbers will only go up. Remember, our budgeted expenditure for this year is 45 trillion. For the next year, in nominal terms, this will grow at least 10 to 11%, because that's the number we are looking at for at least the next 5 years, 6 years from a nominal growth perspective. There's no reason why this capex will not really pick up and then crowd in the private corporate capex.
Right, and as we come towards the conclusion of this conversation, India is also the G20 president, spearheading many engagements and conversations. Final thoughts from our panelists about the manner of leadership that India can present as far as global economic engagement, a greater role in the region and the world, sustainable economic engagement, green development. What are your thoughts on that? Mr. Banerjee, if I can come to you very briefly, I'll take comments from each one of you.
India in the G20 leadership has already announced that India is going to provide leadership for a sustainable green world. And if we can somehow do that, we would have made the change already.
Right. Mr. Basu.
Yeah, I think G20, the objectives have been given, but a few themes which I found interesting, which India is trying to lead through the G20 forum, other than green and sustainable. One would be the digital space. I think there is a lot of work going on in bringing new thinking and policies, because globally, I think the policies are very nascent as well, because even in the developed countries, how do you deal with cross-border movement of data, etc. So I think there is a lot of work going on digital and technology as part of G20. The other one is India is an emerging country, so there are many countries who are not part of G7, the remaining 13 like Indonesia, Brazil, India, and what are the issues that confront them, lifting more people out of poverty, ensuring that we have a balanced development which takes care of vast country like India, regional disparities are also addressed and things like that. I think all of them do find part of the G20 themes that are being set up.
Right. Dr. Ghosh, your thoughts, sir?
Yeah, just a couple of things. The first thing, I think India, since the war started, has demonstrated remarkable resiliency in terms of the leadership in, I think, keeping an equidistance away from all the troubles, but at the same point ensuring that the domestic interest is met. For example, the supply of oil. And taking this forward, I think in this G20 year, couple of things are important. I think the India stack story is a success story which could be showcased to the entire world, and hopefully I think that story could echo with the other sections of the other countries and other things to making a globally digital infrastructure which could benefit all of us. And finally, I think on the and this is also an important point, I think India has said that it wants a carbon-free economy. It has laid out a path. It's a difficult journey, but today the share of renewables in our total power sector is 29%. Is already 29. Thermal is 58%, and there are significant opportunities for the ecosystem to support this renewable space. Hopefully, that could be another way of looking into the future in terms of the G20 initiative.
Right. Dr. Patnaik, your final thoughts, the opportunity that India has at the moment with this leadership position in G20.
So how important is India? There are IMF figures that have come out yesterday, in fact. India and China will contribute to 50% of incremental global growth. Yes, half of global growth next year is going to come from two countries, India and China. If you include the rest of Asia, that is 75% of global incremental growth that is going to come from this particular region. This is one point. Second point, Prime Minister Modi's commitment to net zero is the most significant commitment in the global movement towards net zero. Let me tell you why. India's per capita power consumption is a fraction of global per capita power consumption. For people in the developed world to shift towards renewable energy would require an enormous amount of move away from their existing power sources. For India, that will not be at a substitution of our thermal power. We can keep adding renewable power, as Soumyakanti mentioned. Our targets are to reach 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. This kind of investment, this kind of spend will require investments of about $10 trillion over the next decade or so. And this is one place which will, which shows how important India is. I need not repeat the success of India stack, which has already been pointed out by my colleagues.
But absolutely, and those were in fact the final thoughts of this conversation. We talked about India's growth story, the manner in which the union budget articulates the way forward, not just for the year, but for the decades ahead of Amritkaal, when India aspires to emerge as a developed country when it celebrates 100 years of independence. On that note, let me thank all our esteemed panelists, Mr. Robin Banerjee, Mr. Arijit Basu, Dr. Soumyakanti Ghosh, Dr. Tirthankar Patnaik, and a round of applause. Thank you very much to all our audience members for taking forward the conversation. And with that, we conclude this special presentation. Namaskar. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Wonderful, sir.
Thank you, sirs. Thank you, Shubhendu.
Wonderful engaging, sir.
After this meaningful session, we will now break for tea. The next session would be Sabka Budget. Please be in time. 15 minutes is our break time.